Okay.
I just before we start, I mentioned to you in the email. So just I mean, I don't know how combative it's going to end up being, but I'm not planning on trying to make a point of that this time. I'll just as I said, conversation. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Cool.
Is it going to be half an hour again this time, or?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yep, cool. No worries. I am joined again by Karen Strawn, who is as accommodating as she is articulate. Karen, thank you very much for doing this again.
Thanks for having me again.
Again, more than welcome. So, I guess the first thing I just wanted to start off with is just quickly revisiting the claim you made last time about boys being rejected from refuge shelters in many cases, because I think that's the point last episode where things really took a turn because I was really very affected by that.
Yeah.
And it was the first thing that I started looking into after we spoke. And essentially, I guess, I mean, it's probably not surprising that it's a hard thing to look into. So, I mean, I've come to understand that it does happen. It certainly has happened. It might still. I can't really tell how often it does, and I suppose I'm skeptical that it's common at this point. For what it's worth, just one of your
Hmm.
commenters on the episode that you uploaded to your channel the other day, he backs you on this. He
Hmm.
said, this is a quote, I have experienced the shelter ordeal that she talked about, and I live in the US. I was 12 and wasn't allowed to be there unless my mother was there. When she was at work, I had to leave. They didn't care where I went, which is charming.
Yeah.
And he says that's from Pennsylvania in 1995, that experience.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, before I go into anything else I looked into on this, I guess I just wanted to clarify because you said it happens in many cases, and obviously many is a bit of a subjective word, and I know that.
It is. It is. It probably, I would guess that it happened more often in the past. Erin Pitsey, who was essentially the founder of the domestic violence shelter movement, she opened the world's first domestic violence shelter in 1971 in
Mhm.
Chiswick, England. She said that after her shelter, I mean, she ran her shelter completely different from the way they're run these days. Always had adult male volunteers in the shelter, working with the kids, working with the women.
Yep.
There were men all around all the time, um, and of course these men would have been vetted and uh, guaranteed not to be, convicts or people who would be dangerous, right? But she felt that it was important that, in particular, the children be exposed to men who were not violent, who were not frightening, all of those things, right?
Yep.
And the women as well. It's therapeutic for women as well who have been through something difficult like an abusive relationship to be exposed to men who are kind and helpful and nice and peaceful and who would never think of hitting you. Absolutely a wonderful approach for her to have taken. But the shelter movement that she founded, it was kind of subject to a hostile takeover by the women's liberation movement at the time. In the, I believe, late 70s, they managed to get control of her charity, radical feminist uh, group, I guess a radical feminist group. They renamed it. It's now known as Refuge UK, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
they completely changed the way they did things. Men aren't allowed to go in and fix equipment or do any kind of repair work or do any kind of maintenance work. They're not allowed in there at all. And she said one of the first things that they did was essentially say that boys over 12 cannot be in the shelter. Um, but I would suspect that that has changed and relaxed, and it is no longer necessarily going to be a widespread thing.
Okay.
But from anecdotes that I have heard, it does still happen. That boys over a certain age, and the age varies, will not be welcome in the shelter because it is believed that they pose a risk to the girls and women around them.
Mm.
So basically, the moment he sprouts peach fuzz and his voice cracks, he's seen as a man rather than as a boy. He's seen as a potential perpetrator rather than as one of the victims of the situation. So, um, and again, because in particular in the U.S., this is going to be it's going to be different from state to state to state.
Yep.
It's very, very difficult to find any kind of, and it's not something, I don't think it's something that these shelters are particularly proud of either. So it's not necessarily something that they're going to advertise.
Well, yeah, and I mean, on that, I checked with Canada as well. I emailed Shelter Safe, which I suppose is a sort of meta organization for
Yeah.
this kind of thing, and
Mm.
they got back to me. And as you say, I mean, it just depends on how charitable you want to be. I mean,
Yeah.
they might have a motive for covering that up, or someone else might think that that's sort of conspiratorial. I don't want to really make
Oh,
any, any
there may
but,
actually have been laws passed. Canada has actually a fairly good record in terms of protecting the rights of children.
mm-hmm.
And they would actually, I would suggest that Canada would be, and Canada also has, um, they have a governmental structure that's very different from the US. The federal government has much more control over what individual provinces are and are not allowed to do in terms of, even things like health and social services and stuff like that. So what you're looking at is you're probably looking at a system that it has probably come down from the federal government that Canadian shelters are not allowed to turn away boys until age 16 or age 18 or whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, that last part is actually exactly what they said, although they said by and large the majority, so sort of in the other way, by and large the majority of shelters in Canada do not have the policies like the ones you describe, and none mandated by government, which I don't know if I'm reading that correctly, but I think that would say that.
None mandated by government does not mean that it's forbidden by government. So
Yes, exactly.
that's the thing. And the policy, I mean, there's a difference between law and policy, right?
Yeah.
What they're saying is a shelter could have this policy, there's no law against it.
Yes, no, I accept that. I was just saying that you could interpret none mandated by government as them saying that they're not mandated by government to accept children either, but I guess that might not be reasonable to read into it. I don't know.
Well, it's not mandated by government that they have to exclude children or boys of over a certain age.
I
It's
understand
not
that. Yeah.
not mandated by government, but that's completely different. It's kind of like if the bank tells you it's our policy that you must have this in order to get a mortgage. Well, maybe that's not mandated by law that you have this thing in order to get a mortgage from a bank. But unless it's actually forbidden by law for the bank to demand that, the bank is perfectly entitled to do so.
Yes, we're 100% on the same page on that, so that's
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, cool.
So it is very difficult. Like I do think that, you're looking at something in terms of if it's still going on in Canada, it's not something that's going to be advertised.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Fair enough.
So,
All right, well, I'll move on from that. The other thing I wanted to sort of go into is we were talking last time about legislation around prosecuting rape charges in Canada, and you were talking about some of the reforms that were being proposed. So I read a bit into that as well, and I get the impression that you might have been exaggerating the situation a little bit. But having said that, I'm not exactly a brilliant legal mind, so maybe you're right. So you said that the goal of the amendments was the proponents' goals were to essentially remove any possible defence, and you gave a pretty extreme example of the complainant sort of texting the accused directly before the alleged rape, saying, "Hey, baby, come over, let's have some fun," and then saying, "That was great, let's do it again sometime afterward."
mm-hmm.
So I read into the proposed amendments, and I'm not sure that scenario would be forbidden from going to court.
No, it would not be forbidden from going to court. And this is one of the things that's very, very difficult when you're pressed for time to explain the reason why you believe there are implications to that. It would be subject to rape shield test. And that means that all of that evidence would have to be disclosed to the uh, not just to the prosecutor, but to the complainant and to the complainant's counsel in a closed hearing prior to the trial, right? So what you're looking at is, and one of the most interesting things is prior, just recently, just over, last year, just prior to this bill being proposed, we had a very, very famous case in Canada called Gian Gomeshi. He was a radio show
I
host
brought it up
on,
last time.
yeah, on
Yeah.
CBC. And one of the things, the way the trial went was the the prosecutor asked, and I'm just going to use one complainant as an example, but this was true of all three complainants to some degree. The prosecutor asked the complainant, "What did you do after he assaulted you?" And the complainant said, "I avoided any further contact with him. I didn't want anything to do with him. I only ever communicated with him if it was necessary for my work. I just absolutely did not want to ever see him again." Right?
Hmm.
And she testified to this under oath repeatedly. And then on cross-examination, the defense counsel asked her all of these questions again, and she answered them all the same. So she repeatedly testified to the same thing. I never had anything to do with him again. I avoided anything, any contact with him whatsoever, 100%. And well, she this is an offense that was alleged offense that was about 10 years old, and I guess the complainant didn't realize that Mr. Gomeshi would have saved her emails, her love letters, her text messages, the photos that she sent him and tagged him in, because all of that stuff was in a folder on the desk of the defense attorney, while this woman is testifying. Yeah, I had nothing further to do with him. All of that information. So a photo of her filleting a beer bottle that she sent to him, a love letter handwritten sent to him days afterwards, signed, "I love your hands." Um, Photos of her the next day after she was allegedly assaulted with her arms around him, gazing adoringly up at him. And then a year or more of emails and text messages indicating a pattern of romantic pursuit on her part of Gomeshi, and a pattern of exquisitely polite brush-offs on his part, as
Hmm.
in, she'd say, "Oh, well, we're going to be in Vancouver for the weekend for the music festival. I demand that you better hang out with me." And him replying, "Well, it's a working weekend for me, so I might not be able to manage,
Yep.
being able to see you." Right. So, and this being 6 months afterwards, and all of this, right? So it was completely, and here's the really interesting thing, for anybody who cares about legal questions, is that the judge in his decision, he actually explicitly stated that all of that behavior on her part could not be used as any kind of evidence that the assault had not taken place, because he had been trained as a judge to understand that victims of sexual assault do not always behave in ways that we find reasonable or rational. They often do things that we would consider to be completely unrealistic, completely irrational, completely counterintuitive to what we would expect. And so none of her behavior in that year following the alleged assault could be used to undermine the credibility of her claim that she was assaulted. Okay. And
Yep.
the only thing that he was basing his decision on to acquit Gomeshi in this particular set of charges was that her testimony was unreliable and it did not match the only available physical evidence.
Yep. So
Right. And so what this law would have done had it passed before this particular trial he would have had to show this complainant, Gomeshi would have had to show this complainant every single email, the love letter, all of it, the whole shebang, right, to her prior to trial. And this is a woman who had repeatedly perjured herself on the stand, not just relating to the alleged assault, but relating to discussing the case with one of the other complainants, and then lying and said she had not, and all kinds of things, right? So she'd been thoroughly undermined in her credibility, or, in terms of being able to trust her to tell the truth. And in those conversations with the other complainant that she denied even occurred, but were recorded in hundreds of text messages on chat boards, she was essentially talking with the other complainant about how great it would be to see him crash and burn, how she really wanted to see him suffer, all of this stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I really don't think she would have spared 2 seconds of her conscience on making her testimony on the stand conform to the evidence that she was shown in that closed hearing during the rape shield test.
I understand it, and we talked about that particular case last time, and as I said, I thought what transpired there was shocking as well. Just so, I mean, essentially your point is that yes, it would be admissible, but the problem is that
it would not necessarily be admissible. It would likely be admissible. But you can never predict what a judge is going to do.
Okay, yeah, and fair enough. But yeah, the main problem, if it is admissible, is that then the complainant gets a heads up, and then they can structure their story in anticipation of that, as opposed to being able to be checked for inconsistencies like Marie Henin did with Ducateur or whatever it is. Yeah.
Lucy Ducateur. Yeah.
Sure.
So I mean, it just, what it does is it makes it much more difficult. It makes it much more easy for. And here's the thing, right? Because you might say, okay, well, you're assuming that women are going to falsely accuse all over the place and whatever, right? But prosecutors are required to maintain a very, very, very professional distance from all of their witnesses, including their complaining witnesses. They're not allowed to, they are expected to limit the amount of time that they spend with any of their witnesses so as not to taint their testimony. Witnesses are kept out of the courtroom until after they have testified themselves, so that their testimony will not be tainted by hearing or viewing other testimony and other evidence, right? So what we have all of these safeguards, right? And these safeguards don't exist because we have an assumption that people are going to lie maliciously on the stand. It's because we recognize that people are fallible, right? And that people can be persuaded to exaggerate their testimony, or to match their testimony to somebody else's after they've witnessed that person testify on the stand, to back them up, sometimes with the best of intentions, believing that they're doing the right thing, sometimes entirely subconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But, and yet we are willing to allow the complaining witness to look at all of the potentially exculpatory evidence that the defense might bring, if it involves a communication with, of a sexual nature. So.
One thing I wanted to do as well, because I've got a lot of sympathy with you in regards to the legislation in Canada for this kind of thing is probably too weighted against the accused. But I thought it might be interesting, rather than to talk about what the legislation is, talk about what you think it should look like. And I just wanted to start by looking at the twin myths in your legislation. So it says that the twin myths are, one, that their past sexual experience makes them more likely to have consented to the sexual activity that forms the subject matter of the charge, or two, that their past sexual activity makes them less worthy of belief. Those are the two things that you can't essentially lend evidence toward to lend credence to in a case.
It's basically just because she had sex with these 19 guys doesn't mean she consented to sex with the 20th guy. That's the first one, and you can't assume that she'd be more likely just because she has a history of promiscuity or whatever, or she's not a virgin or whatever. That myth, I don't know that many people necessarily buy into it anymore. And the other myth is she is a soiled woman, and therefore you can't take anything she says to be honest because she is of bad character.
Yeah, and you would agree that those types of arguments shouldn't be admissible in an ideal system, right? Would you?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. And judges who actually, I mean, there was a case, R.V. Ewanchuk, back in, oh God, when was it, 1996 or something like that, where a judge and an appellate court essentially allowed in a completely unrealistic, ridiculous situation, allowed a defendant to bring the defense of a an innocent but mistaken belief in consent in a situation where, like, nobody in their right mind should have, said to themselves, well, he there's in a reasonable man's mind, he
Yeah.
of course he would have believed that she consented. It was an absolutely atrocious case. And that case gets referred. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the precedent was an excellent one. But what it basically means, the absence of a no does not mean the presence of a yes, right? And
Yeah.
it's cited in legal cases all across Canada, constantly, because it was such it was such an egregious case, and the Supreme Court corrected these horrible decisions, right, that represented not just sort of a lack of moral fiber, but also a mistake in law. But that case gets cited. But when that case gets cited, in the using the case law, right, the entire surrounding context of that is what is being cited. So, I mean, what we're talking about, the absence of a no does not indicate a yes. Well, that particular case is a middle-aged man who had already had a history of sexual offenses going back decades, um, who was interviewing a 17-year-old girl for a job, kind of cornered her in his trailer. He was a cabinet maker, and he was like, come into my trailer and I'll show you some of my cabinet work. Cornered her in there, closed the door, and then repeatedly sexually assaulted her, repeatedly put his hands on her in a sexual way. He would stop when she said no and give it a minute, and then put his hands on her again. And the entire thing escalated until he was lying on top of her in the trailer, with his penis inserted up the leg of her shorts,
Yeah.
and grinding on her. I mean, like, this is not. I mean, like, in what universe could a man successfully argue that? Well, I thought she wanted it. When she, repeatedly said no, 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 and when the context of that situation, there's nothing sexual about the context of that situation whatsoever. And so, I mean, that was an excellent decision by the Supreme Court. But then when you
Rather
take that
obvious.
out of the
Yeah.
case law and you instantiate it into the statutes, that a yes, the absence of a yes does not, of a no does not mean yes, you're also applying it to established couples. You're applying it to everybody who touches any other person in a sexual way in any context whatsoever. So if I'm standing at the sink washing dishes, and my man comes up behind me and kind of grabs me by the hips and presses himself against me, and I say, oh my God, just go, just leave me alone, he's already sexually assaulted me. He's already committed a crime, because the absence of a no did not invite him, did not imply that I would be okay with him touching me in that way, right?
Yeah.
And one of the hilarious things um, about some of this case law that's being instantiated is one of the actual Supreme Court decisions, came out of RVJA, came out of a maliciously false accusation. And it was found to be maliciously false by the appellate court. It was one of the facts before the Supreme Court that the accusation had nothing to do with the sex that that formed the event in question, right? It had to do with the fact that 2 months later they broke up, and he said he was going to seek custody of their son.
Yeah. Yeah, I've read you talk. I've seen you talking about that case before. So I appreciate that a lot of these essentially originally legitimate cases, although that's an example of a case that wasn't legitimate actually originally, end up leading to precedents which aren't helpful in the future. So that's all fine. We're in a bit of a difficult situation here, Karen. We've got just about 5 minutes left, and I thought we'd be covering those two subjects in sort of quicker time than we ended up doing. Again, sorry,
Oh
I
dear.
don't like cutting you
If
off. I've got a kind of heavy one I wanted to go into. Do you think I could like borrow another 5 minutes or what have you
Oh
from you?
yeah, no, sure, I can stay a little bit longer, no problem.
I appreciate it. So, just a bit of background on this. I got in terms of feedback from last episode, a friend of mine messaged me, and just first of all, by the way, what you were saying about domestic violence really resonated with him. He shared a story with me. He had never told me before that 10 years ago he got into an argument with his girlfriend. He went into sort of a jealous rage, threw a bottle at him, attacked him, and then he kind of pushed her away, called the police, and when the police showed up, they tackled him. So that's sort of
Hmm.
an anecdote that kind of matches what you're saying. That was just a tangent, though. It's not a domestic violence question. Just that same friend mentioned to me that as feedback to sort of try and get you next time, he said, you should bring up the Middle East. And I essentially said to him, you don't know this woman. Now, this is something I did actually consider bringing up last time, and I'll be dead honest with you, Karen. The main reason I think I didn't last time is that I didn't want to put myself in a position of being able to say, I argued with someone that women are oppressed in the Middle East and I lost that argument. So it's something that what you've said in the past on this, I think is something that you've often been misrepresented on a bit.
Yes.
And I think, in spite of that, I still disagree with you on this. And what I wanted to do to test both of those things
Hmm.
is I actually sat down and wrote out what I perceive your argument to be here. And I wanted to read that to you and just,
Okay.
yeah, see if you think I'm on the right page. And then if, yeah, we can go from there.
Okay.
So, it's not inaccurate to say that women are oppressed under a regime such as the Taliban, for instance, in ways that men are not. But that does not mean that it is fair to conclude that women are necessarily more oppressed than men under that regime overall, as men are also oppressed in ways which women are not. For instance, a woman must cover herself up from head to toe before leaving the house and is forbidden from receiving an education and working. Girls as young as 12 can be forced into marriages, which are often abusive beyond the inherent abuse of being married off as a child. On the other hand, men do not just have the right to work, but the obligation, as well as an obligation to provide for their families and an obligation to fight in battle. These obligations are even extended to male children, with boys making up the vast majority of child labourers and close enough to 100% of child soldiers. Not only do these disadvantages exist, but they are seldom viewed as gendered issues, despite applying to males nearly exclusively. This is not to say that men are oppressed more than women. It's impossible to make an objective judgment on that, or vice versa. It is to say that such a question is unhelpful. Both sexes have a unique disadvantages, and when criticising the way of life in certain Middle Eastern societies, we should be doing so with a goal of improving life for everyone, rather than just women specifically. How close was that?
That was so good. That was so good. That was excellent. That was exactly what I always try to put forward.
Okay, very good. So I'm glad that I've effectively steel manned you there.
You did.
Now I won't even attempt to make any equivocations on the child soldier stuff or anything like that. But when we're just talking about grown men and women in societies like this, what I'd submit is that I think I think it's human nature, not masculine or feminine nature, but human nature to sort of have a desire for agency. So even if that agency comes with a very large burden of responsibility and risk of death and so on, I think so. It's true that life sucks for men and women in different ways, but the way in which it sucks for women just involves a degree of subjugation that I mean, not being able to even show your face in public, which it just strikes a chord with people on a really visceral, deeper level. Do you see what I'm saying with that?
Well, it really does strike a chord with people that women are forced to cover up in those ways. But one of the things I think that people really have a hard time, and feminists are starting to do this. They're starting to do this in terms of female genital cutting and things like that. They're starting to acknowledge that those kinds of things, and all the way up to and including dress codes, are largely they're often considered women's business. So when the Saudi driving ban for women was lifted, I read an article. I actually think it was in the Guardian, and this is what surprised me the most about it was they interviewed one of the women who was very, very pleased about the lifting of the ban,
Mm-hmm.
and she said that there are still people in this country, men and women, who are very, very conservative. And we will be facing the fight is not completely over. The fight now is for social acceptance. And we will be getting a backlash from both men and women who hold conservative views. And, when you actually take a look at who disapproves, right, of a young woman dressing immodestly in Western culture. It's not just going to be her dad. It's going to be her
Yep.
mom,
Would
right,
when
and
Can
all
I
of
just
these things.
interject
And so
really quickly?
the norms are constructed by both men and women, is what I'm getting at.
Yep, and that's what I want to interject about is that I mean, wouldn't even a lot of feminists, and I know there's tons of different schools of feminism, but wouldn't a lot of feminists actually be fine with conceding that point to you that men and women enforce certain, you know,
Yes,
demeaning
but
standards?
one of the things that they would say is that men have men are the ones who actually have the real power, right? And women's forms of power, if they even have them, are moot. They don't exist to any degree, to a significant degree, to make any of these changes. It's really up to the men. The men have the hard power. And they would also say that these norms are functions of toxic masculinity, and women's support for them are internalized misogyny. So, I mean, there is no toxic femininity. The concept doesn't really exist. At least, I guess it might now after men's rights activists started using those words. But it always kind of got put into this whole thing where men are the ones who are performing the actions and making the decisions, right? And women are the ones who are brainwashed into hating themselves enough to go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it completely, I mean, both men and women have a longing for agency. And yet feminists, the way they look at this, they deny any role of women's agency in terms of enforcing these norms. These women are doing it because they've been brainwashed into hating themselves, and they are victims of these outside forces that were created by men. So all of the misogyny has been generated by men and their toxic masculinity and their male dominance and male power, and the women are just going along with it because they've been taught all their lives to hate themselves. And I just don't. When I listen to Middle Eastern women talking about their roles, I don't see them talking about how they feel subjugated, how they feel, beaten down, how they feel completely like people are wiping their shoes on them. I see them talking often about how women in the West have it very, very difficult compared to them because their men let them allow them to carry heavy things and to do all of this stuff, and sometimes expect them to go out and work, and we don't have to. And I was watching a group of Middle Eastern women talking about women's rights,
Mm-hmm.
and they were very much on board. One of them even said, We don't want to be the equal of a man. We do not want all of the responsibilities and worries. We just want our equal rights.
Right. Yeah. I guess you could have the equal rights without the equal responsibilities. I mean, she is technically right there, isn't she? I mean, it's not
Oh,
inherently a
okay. So
contradiction.
she, but okay, so if she
I'm
has the
not saying
right
it's
to
right.
go out and work, if she has the right to go out and work and she doesn't need her husband's permission, but he's responsible for providing all of the necessities of the family out of his income, and he cannot touch her income,
I'm
which
with
is
you.
true under
I'm with you.
Sharia.
Yep.
Um, okay, so now she needs transportation to and from work. She maybe needs a uniform for work. She needs daycare for the kids, right? That all comes out of his paycheck, not hers.
No, hey, I'm with you. I mean, I do think that if you're getting the rights to work, you should have basically the same responsibilities, or I think more ideally, you don't have a mandated responsibility imposed on you. It's just, you work, you choose what to do with the
That's
money, and that.
that's why you need to look at the whole picture.
I understand, and I'm with
Yeah.
you. I'm with you. I just wanted to clarify that. I guess the only thing I'll quickly add, last thing, and I'll let you respond to that, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So you often, yeah, you do talk about how if we're going to give the rights, we also need to correct the responsibilities that and obligations that men have. Totally fine.
Hmm.
With leaving the house kind of covered in a trash bag, I mean, we could just make it so you don't have to do that without doing anything else. I mean, there would be no negative consequence in my mind.
Well, many Muslim countries are perfectly fine with women. If you go to Iran, you'll find even the hijab is not worn the way it is worn by many other Muslim women. Often it's showing that they have bleached their hair blonde. It's
Yep.
showing enough of their hair, showing their nicely made up faces. And the way they dress, yes, they technically cover their legs. They cover them with tights, and then they wear a mini skirt, right? So I mean, it's they're showing off their bodies, but they're doing it in compliance with the letter of Sharia.
But in the
As
Taliban
in
example, though,
the Taliban example, the Taliban is a unique case, and I hesitate to use that as an example of what would be normal in any Middle Eastern society. What I think that they're considered to be extremely harsh in most Middle Eastern societies.
they
And
are.
most men don't want this life for their daughters or their sons, a life under that. But I think that um, they're given the chaos that led to the establishment of the Taliban as the regime in charge. Um, what you were looking at is an environment of extreme uncertainty where you could get killed for almost anything or for nothing at all. It was a horrible, horrible existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what the Taliban did was essentially they promised, okay, here's a straight and narrow path. As long as you don't step off the path, we won't shoot you in the back of the head. And for a lot of the people who supported and some of the people who actually say that they miss the Taliban, for them that was like, okay, I can walk that straight and narrow path and never step off, right? And I won't be shot in the head. It's better than never knowing what action on my part is going to get me killed. So, I mean, when you look at it in the full context of what was going on at the time, I can understand why there would have been some people who welcomed the Taliban, why there would even be some people now who say that they miss the Taliban. Um, but I don't think it's indicative of anything that could possibly be sustainable over any length of time. Um, I just don't think that it would have lasted. Even without intervention, it would not have lasted, because it is just too despotic. It is
Yep.
too strict, and it's too strict on everybody. Um, but like this is I would never want to live even under the mildest form of Sharia,
Of course,
right?
yeah.
A form of Sharia like in Iran, which is a fairly progressive Muslim country. I would not want to live under those rules. I would not want my life to be micromanaged and my relationship with my partner, my male partner, to be micromanaged by the system in that way. Um,
And I don't
You
think
know,
anything you've said here or anywhere else would imply otherwise. And as I said, I've kind of heard people making out as if that is what the kind of thing you've said is sort of getting toward, which I just think is, as I say, very very unfair. Um,
well,
and
yeah, and just because I point out that women do get some benefits out of that system and entitlements, and men have some obligations and disadvantages
doesn't mean you're saying the
under
system is
that
good.
system.
Yeah.
No, I don't. In fact, I it's one of the most interesting things. Allison did this on Twitter once. It was an experiment. She said, okay, well, women are victims of this under Sharia. Well, men are victims of that under Sharia. And she was accused of defending Sharia. And she said, how can I be accused of defending Sharia? I just told you that there are twice as many victims of Sharia, um, twice as many as you thought. How can you
It's an
interpret
interesting
that
point. Yeah.
as me defending Sharia? Right. So I mean that's really, it's really about how we should be approaching some of these problems in these other countries if we are going to approach them at all. We need to be really looking at it in a holistic way, where we take everybody's experience into account.
Okay.
So,
Well, Karen, you've given me an inch and I've taken a mile with your time. So, again, thank you again. It's been an absolute pleasure from the very start. So, cheers.
oh, thank you again.
Cool. Cool. Yep. End of podcast.